Welcome to episode 7 of the Barnes on Bama podcast. I'm your host, Owen Barnes, and we've got a really good one in store for you today. Going to be breaking down the atmosphere that was Alabama and Tuscaloosa's first ever college basketball college game day, as well as a look at the game that was yesterday against Tennessee, result not happening and ending up exactly how Alabama fans would have hoped, as well as looking ahead to what's going to be an incredibly tough matchup in Gainesville. The SEC regular season race may be done with if Tennessee can win out. However, if Alabama has a chance at still winning a share of the title, they have to win in Gainesville coming up, as well as the next game against Arkansas at home. But we'll talk about all of that here coming up on this episode. So let's get right into the show. So let's start with college game day. I went, as well as my girlfriend, we went over to college game day. The atmosphere was incredible. The students really showed out and showed that Tuscaloosa and Alabama is not just a football school, as they said multiple times on the show, and as Nato has coined it, it's a championship school. The fan support and the people that were there and waiting early for a college game day that happened at noon Eastern, 11 Central for a 7 Central tip game was awesome. There were fans waiting in line. There were students waiting in line outside. And the game wasn't going to be happening for another 8 hours. So I thought that the atmosphere and the involvement and everything that happened as a part of game day was really, really fun, was a really good environment, especially with how far there was in between game day and the game. I thought that it was funny that Jay Williams, played into his tennis court comments for the second time. He did it in the Auburn game, which was his next time back in Tuscaloosa, as well as mentioned it a couple of times on the show. The only bad part of that was, for anybody that was there, Alabama really made us look bad by the inability of our students to hit three-point shots. Jay Williams was trying to give away $100 and couldn't do it until a student assistant for the media and Crimson Tide Productions, I believe, ends up hitting a three-point shot and hills nonetheless. But, either way, it was a fun atmosphere. It was a fun time. Reese Davis's coming home story, he's done quite a few times with college game day for college football, but it was his first time coming back for college basketball, and it was just a really fun environment overall. It was a really good thing to showcase what Alabama has to offer from a basketball standpoint, and I thought that it was something big that shows where NATO has this program and the ability of this program to get to the heights that it has the ability of being. There were also comments by a couple of people on the show wearing plaid jackets in honor of Wimp Sanderson. And I think that that's something that Nate's been able to bring back is Alabama. This is not the first time Alabama's been good, but it's almost bringing back to the glory days that were at Wimp. And Alabama's also reaching heights that potentially, if he can get to an Elite Eight, that Wimp himself wasn't even able to reach. So that just really shows where the program is at and where it's headed. And I thought that that was a really, really good environment and a really good showcase of what Alabama basketball is and can be. So then we move on to the game. The game happened at 7 o'clock. The crowd and the atmosphere was as good as hoped, expected, and advertised. The crowd was absolutely phenomenal. From Alabama's standpoint, there were a few Tennessee fans in attendance, less than the Auburn game, but they had a respectable showing for an away crowd as well. And I thought that overall the crowd attendance was absolutely incredible. There was a point in the first half, Alabama gets down 10 points. It was 29-39, and Alabama locks in on defense, hits a few big shots, and then Alabama goes into the half up 2. Alabama's up 41-39, and I looked to the people sitting around me, and we had just talked about how we were down 10, and you really got to cut this lead to 4 or 5 before half if you want to feel comfortable, going into the game. Alabama had a fight about them. They turned over the ball a few times early. Nate talked about it even in the post game, but they had 3 early turnovers. But then Alabama finished the half only having 6 turnovers in the first half. Compared to the game in Knoxville, you had to be happy with that. Alabama, you wish the 3 quick turnovers didn't happen to start the game, but to have 6 turnovers at halftime and then end up being up 2, you had to be absolutely thrilled. I saw Hunter Johnson in the concourse, and he said he was tickled pink. That's kind of how I was feeling as well. In my opinion, if we had been down 4 or 5, that would have been a good showing for the ability to cut it and be within striking distance at home with the crowd behind you going into the second half. but up two I thought was a perfect example of where Alabama needed to be. Some things that attributed to Alabama being where they were: Alabama was shooting about 35-36% from three. They were winning the rebounding battle, and Jonas Adu and Tobe Awaka both were in foul trouble, as well as Dalton Connect. Awaka and Adu had both been sitting since pretty early in the half. Adu gets his first two fouls with about 15:30 and sits for the rest of the half. Awaka gets his maybe around 10 minutes to go in the half, and then Josiah Jordan-James moves to the five, and constantly Rick Barnes was showing that he was not going to play anyone with two fouls. Every time somebody got two fouls, they got sat on the bench. And then it happened with Dalton Connect right before Alabama's 12-0 run, or kind of in the middle of the 12-0 run. Connect gets his second fouls, goes to the bench as well, and finishes the half with not a single person from Tennessee that has two fouls going onto the bench. It was something that I talked to somebody in the concourse about that it kind of shocked me, because Adu was a key in game one, and I talked about him on the podcast as well as in the write-up, that I thought Alabama's ability to defend Adu and not have somebody like Gainey or Vescovi go off was the key to the game. I thought Connect would be able to get his points, but having the other people not hurt you was really the key to the game. The crazy part about this is Alabama holds Dalton Connect to 13. Adu ends up having 12 in very limited minutes, and Alabama loses the game. You know, it's something that I retweeted a tweet by Matt Landry, and I, said to some people around me coming into the game, if you give me the option to say Dalton Connect's only going to have 13 on bad shooting, Alabama's going to out-rebound them, we're going to have 12 turnovers and, play the game that we played, we're going to lead at half, we're going to, hold Tennessee to 81, I would have assumed we win the game. My prediction was 86-81 because I thought there was in no world that Alabama was going to score less than 80 points at home. The way Alabama has scored outside of the Clemson game has been nothing short of incredible. That Clemson game, Alabama had really bad shooting, the atmosphere, everything was just off. And I thought that there was no chance that Alabama was going to let that happen in an SEC game. They had not shown it in any other game so far this year, and I just didn't think it was going to happen. Even in the only other low output game of the year was South Carolina, and Alabama puts up 74, but they win by 27. So you can't be upset with 74 points when you're winning by 27. So I thought there was no chance that Alabama loses the game if all of those things are true. Alabama ends up losing the game with all of those things happening. And so then you look at it as what went wrong. And the answer is fairly simple. Alabama went about 9 minutes without a field goal and was 2 for their last 13, at one point being 1 for 14 just before the last makes at the very, very end of the game. The only points Alabama was scoring in the final roughly 8 minutes of the game was free throws. Now, Nick Pringle did a really, really good job. He hit some free throws that is, for anybody that's watched Nick over the years, not something that has been a guarantee, but Nick's form with the one-handed free throw, he hit some big free throws. I thought that he was as good as he could have been. He gets 9 rebounds. He jumped a steal. Nick was playing with intensity, was playing with effort, and we absolutely needed every minute of it because Grant Nelson ended up fouling out in 17 minutes. I talked about Grant fouling out in 17 minutes of game one, and I thought part of that was due to the whistle being in Knoxville and how good Adu was playing. Well, what confused me about this one is Adu was not playing. Adu, as I mentioned earlier, Adu goes out with about 15:30 to go in the first half, never sees the court again in the first half, but Grant still gets 2 in the first, then fouls out with 6 minutes to go in the second half, with Oates only being able to play him every so often because Grant was in foul trouble. Some of these were pretty questionable calls. One of them, the broadcast even calls, hey, in some places we call that rebounding. By what it looked like he was just boxing out. There was another one where it looked like he got pulled down and, fell to the ground, but he gets the call on him. There were 3 moving screens that Alabama had called on them. It seemed like there were some moving screens that could have been called on Tennessee that were not. So in Nate Oates' mind, it felt like it was a little bit of an off game from a fouls perspective. It's not something he mentioned in the post game, but if you were watching him on the sideline, there were some moments that I definitely thought a technical might have been inbound. There were some calls that were questionable, and it just overall the flow of the game and what you kind of would expect from I don't want to say a home whistle, but the way that a game is called typically is dictated by how the home team plays. The home team, their physicality or lack thereof, typically dictates how the whistle is from the ref's perspective in most games. It seemed like Tennessee still dictated the whistle, even though they were the away team. I don't know if that was just due to Tennessee's physicality, because there were some 50-50 balls, whether it be rebounds or steals or things that Tennessee seemed to be putting that little bit of extra effort that Alabama was not. So that may have induced some of the additional calls. However, no matter what the case, Alabama doesn't get those calls. Alabama doesn't get some of those rebounds. They go on a 9-minute scoring drought and end up losing the game. Alabama ends up shooting, I have it here in front of me, 9 of 37 from 3. They only shoot 24% from 3 coming into the second half. In that first half I talked about, they shot about 35% from 3. One of the pieces that in my mind had part to do with that, and Nate was asked about it in the post game, and I think he acknowledged, hey, he could have maybe done something a little differently, is Davin Cosby only played 10 minutes. He had 6 points in 10 minutes. He was the only player on the team that shot over 50% from 3. He went 2 for 4. Anybody else that made 2 was Mark and Aaron, and they both went 2 for 8. Rylan went 1 for 8. Jaron went 1 for 4. Grant goes 1 for 3. And then Davin goes 2 for 4. Davin also has a really big assist where, he gets up in the air, gets people jumping with him, is able to dump off for a Nick Pringle dunk. So I thought that things were happening positively on the offensive end when Davin was in the game, and for whatever reason, Nate went away from him in the second half. The reason I think this was fairly important is because with Latrell Wrightsell currently being out, Davin was really the only chance for Mark and Aaron to get some rest. And later on in the latter half of this game, it felt like Mark and Aaron's legs were not under them. It felt like you could see the effects of Mark having played 40 minutes against Ole Miss. It felt like you could see some of the effects of not being able to sub at the rate that they were doing earlier in the year, because we didn't have that additional guard with experience that you could rely on. And Alabama had begun to rely on Latrell Wrightsell to be able to get Mark and Estrada some rest, and also to have another guy that was able to knock down shots. The stat that people had talked about is Latrell Wrightsell in games that he scores over 10 points, Alabama was 8-0. Oates mentioned that was actually a decent stat to look at the team because they don't really draw up plays for Latrell. So if Latrell is scoring, it means that the offense is in the flow. I think in a game like this, Latrell would have been huge because Alabama ends up getting off 37 threes. They only got off 21 in game 1. The flow of the offense was such that threes were able to be shot. Tennessee was not blowing them up quite at the level that they were in their own building. And Alabama just missed some shots, quite frankly. Alabama shoots 24% from 3, and it's the difference in the game. Some of those were rushed. Some of those may have not have been the absolute best shot, and some of them may have been settled. But Alabama shooting 24% from 3 compared to their season average of 35 is the difference in the game. Their season average would have been somewhere around 12 to 13 makes. And at worst, this is, a tie game. We're going to overtime, and Tennessee has like 4 guys with 4 fouls. You really like your chances if you went to overtime with the crowd and with the foul trouble that Tennessee was in. So I thought that Alabama's inability to make shots in that last 9 minutes was the difference in the game. The other guy who I want to talk about that didn't get as many minutes as I feel like he should have was Mohamed Diabate. Diabate only plays 7 minutes, but gets 7 rebounds as well as a steal. He's able to poke it free, and those 7 rebounds, He's the only, he ends up tying Nick Pringle for offensive rebounds on the team. They each have 3, tied for the most of the game with Jonas Adu. Yet Mohamed Diabate played 7 minutes. Adu ends up playing 23, and Pringle plays 25. So Diabate in 7 minutes is able to rebound at the same level of 2 guys that played triple the minutes that he did. I'm a little confused why Diabate did not play more in this game. It seems like Nate's, reluctant to play him due to his offensive inefficiencies, and I completely understand that. But there is a standpoint that if you have somebody that's doing that well from a rebounding and defensive perspective, in my mind, he should have been on the floor more. 7 rebounds in 7 minutes is worth additional minutes on the floor. He was doing a good job against Dalton Connect. He brought him in for one of the hardest assignments you could have, what many think of as the SEC Player of the Year. I just think that this is a game that is perfectly fit for Diabate's skill set. He's physical, he's tough, and this is just the game that when you need a tough board, you need a tough take to the rim, Diabate brings that for you. In his 7 minutes, I just don't think is enough. I'm sure this is something that may get questioned, but I think that he's somebody that is being overlooked due to his inefficiencies on offense, but I think his rebounding and defense warrants getting played more than he currently is. And I'd be really curious what ends up happening down the stretch, because if you play a physical team, I think he brings you something that some other guys on the team just either can't or don't have the ability to bring. The last one that I want to talk about is Latrell Wrightsell, and this is a good lead into the Florida game. Latrell ends up warming up prior to the game. It's his first time warming up with the team and being fully with the team thus far since the concussion. He actually goes through full pregame warmups. He was out about 2 hours in advance doing dribble and individual drills. He goes through full shoot around about an hour before the game. And then in the final shoot around, with about 20 minutes prior to the game, he does not come out with the team. What that leads me to believe is Latrell potentially was either a healthy scratch or was right at the end where he's cleared but not sure if he's 100%. And it was a situation where he's, hey, let's not risk it. Like, let's give you another game. I'm not 100% certain on that. But with the atmosphere, the music, the noise, I thought that him going through full pregame warmups led me to believe he's very, very close to being able to play. Nate even mentioned in the postgame, hopefully we get him back for next game. So that leads me to believe either he's been giving some inclination that he may be able to play next game. He may have been a pseudo-healthy scratch this game. But I'd be very curious on what happens in that next game. I think that Latrell Wrightsell makes a difference in that Tennessee game because of how well he shoots from 3 and his ability to take care of the ball. So I think that having him in that Tennessee game would have been huge. However, you didn't, and this Florida game coming up against the guards that they have, Latrell will be a huge addition if you can get him back. So let's move on to the Florida game. So Alabama goes to Gainesville on Tuesday night. And it's going to be an incredibly, incredibly tough game. Florida beat Auburn in Gainesville earlier this year. They beat them pretty decently. It was Auburn. Auburn hasn't won there in quite a few years. Gainesville is not an easy place to play. And in Coleman Coliseum, Florida took Alabama to overtime. Alabama ends up winning by 5 in overtime, but Florida had 5 guys in double figures. I'm looking here at the stats. Clayton has 27. Poland and Richard both have 17. Samuel has 14. Condon has 10. Florida was able to score on Alabama seemingly at will. There were many moments in that game that Zion Poland and Walker Clayton were kind of hitting whatever shot they wanted. They end up missing some shots, but they made a ton of shots. Clayton ends up hitting 4 threes. Looks like Poland hits 1. Richard hits 3. Condon hits another. So, Florida just does a pretty good job shooting. One of the places that scared me in that original Florida game was rebounding because of how badly Alabama had gotten destroyed by A&M on the offensive glass. Florida is the number 3 offensive rebounding team, but prior to that game, they were number 2 just behind A&M. They're still currently number 3 in the country. And Alabama ended up out offensive rebounding Florida in game 1. It was not something that I expected, but it was a key in the game. Florida ends up getting 17 offensive and 27 defensive rebounds, whereas Alabama gets 21 and 33. So Alabama gets 54 to Florida's 44. That's not something I expected. In my opinion, that's something that Alabama is going to need to continue to do in this game against Florida in Gainesville. They're going to have to be tough. They're going to have to rebound at that level if you want to beat Florida on their home court. Typically, in an opponent's stadium, you may shoot worse. They may shoot better than averages. And from a rebounding perspective, there's often a level of physicality and additional effort that happens on somebody's home court. It's just the way that basketball is. That's something that you have to look at for this game, because if that rebounding number goes in Florida's favor, the odds of Florida winning go up with it. Alabama takes it to overtime, ends up winning in overtime, but they beat Florida by 10 rebounds. Florida was the better rebounding team, so in my mind, Alabama had what was an incredible rebounding performance just to go to overtime and end up winning the game. So that scares me a little bit in this game. One thing that was huge in game 1 is Grant Nelson had his best game in Alabama. He ends up going 8 for 11 from 2, hit a 3, 8 rebounds, 6 blocks, got 22 points, played 37 minutes. That was, in my opinion, one of Grant Nelson's best games at Alabama on an offensive and defensive standpoint. He's going to have another big game. We're going to need him down low. The guys who, did a really good job in game 1, Samuel and Condon, combined for 24 points at 6'10 and 6'11. So Grant Nelson, Nick Pringle, they're both going to have big games. Another guy is Micah Handleglin. He had 9 offensive rebounds in game 1. At 7-1, he bullied us on the offensive glass. Alabama does win the offensive rebound battle. However, if we don't get the 21 that we get in this coming game, the way to still be able to beat Florida in the rebounding battle is not let Micah get the number of rebounds he got in game 1. Micah really manhandled us in game 1. He ends up getting 13 of their rebounds. So that's something really just to keep an eye on, is how is Alabama doing keeping him off the offensive glass? Because no other person on their team got more than 2 offensive rebounds. Aaron Estrada ends up getting 5 offensive rebounds for us. Ryling gets 4. So Alabama did a good job getting offensive rebounds themselves, but they give up 9 to a single guy. So that's something we're really going to have to keep an eye on in this game. Florida did a pretty good job on Alabama shooting the 3 last game. They end up letting us only go 8 for 32. So Alabama doesn't have their best shooting night. If you'll remember that Florida game, Alabama shot very poorly in game 1. In the first half, but ends up shooting much better in the second half. Florida is a team that does a little bit better job running you off the 3-point line, although the speed at which they play allows you to still get off threes. So I would expect Alabama still gets off 30-plus threes in this game just due to the speed of the game. This is a game that does fit Alabama's style. This is going to be a very, very up-and-down game. It was in game 1. I fully expect there to be 75-plus possessions. This is going to be a very fast game with the way the offenses are played. I hope that Alabama's defensive effort and intensity that you saw in this Tennessee game was not just because it was in Coleman Coliseum. I hope that it is Alabama being embarrassed by what happened against Kentucky, not enjoying what happened in Oxford at the beginning of that game, and being locked in on the defensive end, and not just because the crowd was behind them. If that's the case and Alabama plays defense at the level that they did against Tennessee, Alabama has a good chance of winning this game. However, if Alabama comes out flat in the first half, if Alabama doesn't defend at the level that they're capable of, If Alabama lets Florida get into a shooting streak and into a groove on offense, this could be a very, very long game in Gainesville. This is a game that I personally have had circled ever since game one. I had it circled prior to game one, but after game one, it scared me even more. And this is a game that, quite frankly, Alabama absolutely has to have. The SEC title, as Nate puts it, is not in our hands. We're going to need some help. Alabama will not win the SEC title or a share of the SEC title if Tennessee wins out. However, if Tennessee drops a game and Alabama wins out, we do win a share of the title. So, with that being said, Alabama has to win out if they want any chance or any possibility at winning the SEC title or a share of the SEC title. That starts with winning this game in Gainesville. I'm a little concerned by how the road games have been here recently. Alabama played poorly in the first half against Ole Miss. Alabama looked terrible at Kentucky, looked really bad looked bad at Tennessee. Kentucky, Auburn, and Tennessee, all top 25 teams. Florida is currently sitting at 31st in KenPom. They're right around that top 30 range. Currently, Alabama only has one top 30 win on the road in KenPom, and it was at Mississippi State. So this is a game that if Alabama wants to compete for the conference and wants to be able to show that they can, win and win on the road, that they have to win. It's going to be tough. They're going to have to make shots, and they're going to have to defend at a high level if that's even going to be possible. So we have a lot ahead of us. I'm very curious how this game goes. I think this is going to come down to rebounding. This is going to come down to three-point shooting, and this is going to come down to how well Alabama can defend. If Alabama can rebound and defend near to the level that they did in this Tennessee game and make some additional shots, I think that Alabama has an okay shot at winning this game. Although playing in Gainesville with this offense does scare me. I'm not sure what to expect, and quite frankly, due to the way that Alabama has played on the road on offense, this is a game that is really going to show the maturity of the team, and do they have what it takes to compete in March and to compete for a title in the SEC and making a run in March. So we have a lot ahead of us. I'm very curious how this game goes. If you're curious and enjoy the content that I'm putting out, whether it be podcasts, the articles I'm writing on Substack, the threads that are coming out on Substack and Twitter, please feel free to subscribe to the channel, subscribe to my Substack or my Twitter. Shoot me a message if you're curious on any additional information. There may be some additional content that I'm putting out. There's some works that I'm talking through with some additional people of some other content that I want to put out as it relates to basketball and football content. So if you are curious or interested in anything in specific, please reach out and stay in touch. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching the podcast, and I will catch you in the next episode. Peace.